Friends, in the 8th module of our program on aesthetics and philosophy, we are going to discuss a text which is essentially dedicated to visual arts. Though the program which we are following is a PG program in visual arts, most of the texts which we have been discussing are not directly connected with visual arts because the aesthetic tradition is not rooted in visual arts. Most of the aesthetic theories are designed for theatre, literature, and we are trying to extend those theories to visual arts. In the later period, after 10th, 11th century, we come across so many texts which talk about the visual arts, but as I told you before, they are more of prescriptive nature. So the first text that is fully dedicated to visual arts and which also tries to inquire into the conceptual matters of visual arts is the Chitrasutra of Vishnudharmottara. Chitrasutra is an appendix to Vishnudharmottara Purana, and there are two more appendices. One is Nritya Sutra and the third one is Pratima Lakshana. But we will talk about those appendices at a later juncture. Visual arts have been discussed in various texts at an earlier juncture also. If you see Vatsyayana's Kama Sutra, Vatsyayana speaks about visual arts. Rather, he is the first person to talk about the 64 arts in which the visual arts are also included. But surprisingly, most of the skills there, the term art or a kala is used not only for specific arts, but any skill is listed under the term kala. Like making garlands is also an art over there, or working on copper sheets is also an art, or even theft has been described as art. Stena karma is robbery. Robbery is also an art. So every skill has been considered as an art in Vatsyayana's Kama Sutra, and the same thing is observed in the later texts like Rayapaseniya Sutta or medieval texts like Shukraniti Sara. The number of arts, though they call 64 arts, but in every text the number doesn't remain 64. It varies from 64 to 84, or sometimes it is even more than that. And the list which you find does not have any hierarchy. All skills have been kept at par with each other. But Vishnudharmottara perhaps is the first text which tries to give a specific importance to the art of painting. It says that like the eagle among the birds or like the king among the people, the art of painting is the supreme most among the rest of the arts. Kalanam pravaram chitram dharma kamartha mokshadam. Among all arts, the art of painting. Now here chitra, there is a slight debate about it. Some people believe that the word chitra does not necessarily mean painting. Chitra is painting and sculpture both. Or some of the scholars also say that chitra is sculpture, chitra bhasa is painting, and ardha chitra is relief sculpture. But whatever it may be, whether it is, but if you see the description later on, it mainly talks about painting and not about sculpture, because it speaks about the preparing of grounds or making drawings and preparing colors. So it is about painting, not about sculpture. So this argument can be suspended for some time while talking about Chitrasutra. So here, for the first time, a text is dedicated to the art of painting and painting only. But it doesn't mean that Chitrasutra does not recognize the importance of other arts. But before we go into that, we'll return to the myth which I have mentioned in my earlier sessions also. It says that Ataparam pravakshami Chitrasutram tavanagha urvashim srijata purve Chitrasutra nupadmacha Narayanena muninam lokanam hitakamyayaha praptanam vanchanarthaya Devastrinam Mahamuni. Thing is more interesting. Sahakara rasam gruhyam urja chakre varastriyam chitrena sa tato jata rupa yukta varapsara. I think I have mentioned this myth in one of the earlier sessions also, that Lord Vishnu, Narayana, he painted a picture of a beautiful lady on his thigh with Sahakara Rasa. Sahakara Rasa is Amra Rasa or the mango juice. And then that lady was brought to life. That is considered to be the beginning of the art of painting. And then this art was taught to Markandeya Muni, and then Markandeya Muni wrote this Chitrasutra while teaching the art of painting to Vajra, the king. Now this is the myth, and at that juncture I told you that in most of the aesthetic texts in India, the origin of art is always explained with the help of such myths. So this myth is a very interesting myth, but again it does not really try to inquire into the actual origin of the art of painting in India. As it is, if you see the history of Indian painting, we hardly know about the evolution of Indian painting tradition, because the earliest known painting, barring the cave paintings, if you are talking about the developed painting, the earliest cave painting in India is found in Ajanta, and the Ajanta painting is highly evolved. Ajanta painting cannot be considered as the beginning of art of painting because it is so sophisticated, it is so evolved that it doesn't appear to be the beginning of any art tradition. So probably we do not know anything about the beginning of art tradition, and that could be the reason why the writer of Vishnudharmottara tries to avoid the question of origin of painting. Because as we discussed earlier, this painting may not be earlier than 6th century AD. I think I have discussed it earlier also, that different scholars have tried to place this text in different periods. Shivaram Murthy places it in the Kushana Gupta transitional period, but Stella Kremrich places it at a very late date, 8th century, and Priyawala Shah, who perhaps is the most important translator and commentator of this text, has placed it in 6th century. And considering the language of this text, I think 6th century is a more convincing date. So in 6th century, when the Ajanta is throbbing with activity, or the activity of Ajanta is just over, this text perhaps has been written, has been compiled. Probably Ajanta must have been the inspiration for the compilation of this text. We do not know, because if you see the descriptions of painting in this text, they resemble with the Ajanta painting. They almost describe Ajanta painting. So this is very interesting, that when the painting tradition of India is at its helm, the text on painting is being compiled. This seldom happens. Otherwise, as I told you earlier, the actual activity and the critical activity or the theoretical activity normally do not go hand in hand. But here you can see that it is a contemporary activity. Anyway, coming back to the text, this Urvashi who came to life and inspired people to paint, and then finally when the art was handed over to Vajra, handed over to Markandeya, Markandeya is imparting it to Vajra. When Vajra requests Markandeya Muni to teach him a particular art, it's very interesting that Chitrasutra is also a part of Vishnudharmottara Purana. And it says that Chitrasutra is incomplete without Chitrasutra. Why? Because Markandeya Muni tells Vajra that it is practically impossible to study any art in isolation. Right in the beginning of Vishnudharmottara, there is a beautiful dialogue between Vajra and Markandeya, that when Vajra asks Markandeya to teach him the art of, I do not remember the exact sequence, but when he asks Vajra to teach him the art of dancing, so Markandeya Muni says that you cannot learn dancing without learning the art of drumming, Atodya. Atodya is the rhythm. Then he says, okay, then teach me Atodya. Then he says, how can you understand Atodya if you do not understand music? Something like that. I don't remember the exact sequence. But Markandeya is telling him that to learn this art, you will have to learn the other art. To learn the second art, you will have to learn the third art. To learn the third art, you will have to learn the fourth art, which obviously talks about the interrelationship between arts. What it is trying to tell us is the arts cannot be seen created and appreciated in isolations because they are interconnected. But at the same time, if you remember our first session, I told you that Indian aesthetic texts are rooted in specific material, specific medium. In India, the aesthetic texts are written about a particular art. We have Natya Shastra, Nritya Shastra, Sangeeta Shastra, or Shilpa Shastra, Vastu Shastra. Unlike the Western tradition, where the aesthetic texts are talking about all the arts. We have already discussed it earlier. Anyway, so, but this discussion on interrelationship of art perhaps is the first discussion on this particular concept, which became very popular in the West at a later juncture. Then later it goes further to talk about the technique of painting and technique in various ways. Now, as I told you that the Shastra Granthas, unlike the Lakshana Granthas, try to inquire into every aspect of that particular art. And here Chitrasutra is starting its discussion with the preparing of grounds. You will find references to preparing of grounds or preparing brushes or preparing paints in some earlier Prakrut texts also. There is a very interesting text which was compiled by one of the later Satavahana kings called Hala Satavahana, and the name of the text is Gaha Sattasai. In Prakrut it is called Gaha Sattasai. In Sanskrit it should be pronounced as Gatha Saptashati. It is a compilation of 700 verses. There are actually more than 7. To Sthana Vishuddhi. Sthana Vishuddhi is preparing the ground for painting, because most of the paintings in this period are painted on the walls and not on paper. We do not find references to painting on papers till the medieval period. Rather, even painting on cloth is also found in 11th century. The earliest evidence of painting on cloth is found in 1060 in Western India. Before that, it seems that most of the paintings were done only on the walls, and that is why the process start with Sthana Vishuddhi. It says that how to prepare the wall, and then it says that this wall, which is prepared with mud, rice husk and some other different types of glues, including the tamarind seeds, which works as an adhesive, this wall is to be covered with a lime plaster which is not thicker than an eggshell. The thickness of the lime plaster should be the thickness of an eggshell. This is the plaster, this is the ground which has to be prepared for painting. But unlike the Western tradition, this is not a fresco painting. They do not work with wet plaster. In fresco, you know that they work with wet plaster and dry colors are applied in it. The Jaipur fresco is also like that. Dry colors are applied on it and then merged with the plaster with an agate stone, with keherwa. But otherwise, it seems that the painting which has been described in Chitrasutra is not a fresco painting. It is dry plaster with wet paints, because the paints which have been discussed later, the paints which have been talked about later are wet paints. They are powdered and they are natural colors, and you also come to know which color they used to filter out yellow color from gomutra or red color. Then you will find a list of different materials from which they used to filter out the colors. Now, so preparing the grounds, preparing brushes, preparing colors, after all these things, the actual art of painting starts. This is only a preparation for the painting, and when it comes to the actual art, it gives several instructions to the artist that what exactly is a good line and how the line should be drawn. Rather, line has been given a lot of importance by Chitrasutra. It is always repeatedly, it says, now there is an interesting shloka which says, Rekham prashansanti acharya, vartanam cha vichakshanaha, striyo bhushanam icchanti, varnadhyam mitare janaha. Rekham prashansanti acharya. Acharya is the master. The masters concentrate only on the line. They appreciate a good line. So drawing is the real soul of painting according to Vishnudharmottara, and that is why it says that the acharyas are appreciative of the lines. Then comes the people who know about art, the people who are good connoisseurs. They appreciate vartanam cha vishakshanaha. Now this vartana is a very interesting concept. Vartana is rendering. We are repeatedly told by the Western scholars that the Indian painting is two-dimensional and the Western painting is three-dimensional. We have been learning this right from our first year days. But if you see Ajanta painting, you will realize that Ajanta painting is not two-dimensional like the later Rajasthani painting or the Jain painting. Only in the medieval times, the Indian painting started becoming flat and two-dimensional. Of course, that pictorial quality is also a very important quality and certainly calls for appreciation. But here, it should not be taken as a universal observation, because in the earlier painting, you can see the attempt towards adding the third dimension to the painting. And then there are various ways of doing it. Vartana, they use different words, Patra Vartana, Binduja Vartana and Reikhika Vartana. Now, to do the rendering, even you use these Vartanas in your painting today. Sometimes you use parallel lines, just parallel lines for shading and rendering. Sometimes we use crisscross. The line where you use just the parallel lines, that kind of Vartana, that kind of rendering is called Reikhika Vartana. Reikhika Vartana because it is created with the help of Rekha. Then Binduja Vartana, where it is stippling, dots. Using dots, you create the volume. That is Binduja Vartana. And Patraja Vartana is the Vartana which is created with the help of crisscross lines. Patra is leaf. When you have crisscross lines, it creates diamond shapes which look like leaves, and that is why it is called Patraja Vartana. So the connoisseurs, they appreciate this kind of rendering, different kinds of rendering. The women, Triyam Bhushanam Icchanti. The women, normally the ladies, they appreciate the decoration of the painting. Bhushanam Icchanti. If the ladies in the painting are shown with lot of ornament and there is a lot of other decoration, the women like that kind of painting. And Varnadhyam Itare Janaha. The common people, they like colorful painting. Now, isn't it a very interesting observation that common people, it's very true, even today you can see that the common people like colorful painting. They are not much concerned about the technicalities or the refinement of the line or refinement of drawing. They like attractive colorful painting, common people. Women like decorative painting. The connoisseurs appreciate the rendering and the master appreciates the lines. So they have given utmost importance to the line, and it seems that the drawing was done twice on the ground. Initially it was painted with a brown color, with Gerua, and then after filling up the colors, it was repainted with a black line. If you go to Ajanta, you will find that the line has been used in various ways. And how the line should be, there are many prescriptions which you will find in Vishnudharmottara Purana, that the line should never be broken, it should not be a dotted line, it should not be a crooked line, it has to be a flowing supple line which defines the forms from its background. So line has been given a lot of importance in this text. Then when we go further, in one of the shlokas, you find the discussion on the gunas and doshas of painting. And while talking about the gunas, we saw that even in literature, even in Alankara Shastra, even in Riti, the gunas and doshas of literature were discussed. Similarly, the guna and dosha of painting are also discussed in Chitrasutra. It says, Sthana Pramana Bhulambo Madhuratvam Vibhaktata Sadrishyam Kshaya Vruddhischa Gunashtakam Midam Smrutam. Which are the 8 important gunas? Which are the 8 important merits of painting? It says sthana, the gesture, the stances. The exact translation would be the stance. Stance is posture, gesture, the way you place your characters in the composition. So their gesture is very, very important. Pramana. Pramana, obviously you know the proportions. And these proportions, we are going to have a separate sessions on the proportions, because these proportions are known as talamana. And these proportions have been discussed in great details in the Shilpa text. Normally, they are measured, these proportions are measured using an interesting system. The distance between these two lines is considered to be this one. Is known as yava. Yava. Yava is jaw. Jaw hota hai na? This is like, this also looks like jaw. So this distance is known as jaw. Then this is angula. The thickness of the finger is angula. Then this is tala. This is vitasta. And normally the length of the face is exactly the length of the tala. In most of the cases, if you try it yourself, your tala will match with your face. Then this is hasta, my hand, and when both the hands are stretched, it is called danda. Now you must be wondering whose hand, whose fingers, whose hand, whose yava. So it is very clearly said that the yava of the patron should be used, or the finger of the patron should be used. So naturally the relative proportions of the figure will match the figure of the patron. If the patron is fat, the figure will be fat. Then there are other prescriptions also, we will discuss them later, that what are the different proportions for different figures. Ganesha should be carved with a certain proportion, Vishnu should be carved with a certain proportion. We are going to talk about talamana and its significance at a later juncture. But this talamana, when we are talking about pramana, it speaks about these pramanas. Bhulambo. Bhulambo is plumbing, plumb line, balances. Bhulamba. Have you seen the bhulamba? If you have seen the masons at work, they use a top-like thing. भवरा होता है वो लट्टू जो होता है, नहीं उसके साथ रस्सी बांधी हुई तुमने देखी होगी. It is a top-like thing with a thread. Do you know what do they use it? It is called plumb line. Bhulamba is plumb line. So maintaining the plumb line, and the bhulambo madhuratva, lyricism. The painting should have lyricism in it. Madhuratva vibhaktata, but it also must have distinction. Every form should be distinct form. If you remember our discussion on Shadanga, that also speaks about the rupa bhed is vibhaktata. Sadrishyam kshaya vruddhischa. Sadrishyam, similarity with the original object. But again, this sadrishyam is not the sadrishyam which is described in the later Shilpa text. Sadrishyam likhyate yattu darpane pratibimbavat. Not that. Here the sadrishyam should be sadharmya, the essential similitude between the object and the picture. Kshaya vruddhi is again another interesting notion which you find in Vishnudharmottara. Kshaya vruddhi means foreshortening. Do you know what foreshortening is? Have you discussed it in your classroom? You call it perspective. When you draw perspective, you know that the objects which are at a distance look smaller than the ones which are closer to you. The closer objects look larger. So what exactly is the relationship between this Kshaya Vruddhi has been discussed in this chapter. There is a small piece of writing which discusses the Kshaya Vruddhi and the Rujusthanakas. Rujusthanakas are the postures. Ruju is the frontal view. When I'm standing in front of you with my face towards you, this is Ruju. When I take a half turn, it is called Ardha Ruju. Then if I turn fully, it is called Rujvagataha. So my positions will change the drawing accordingly, and then the perspective will also change according to my positions. So the Rujusthanakas and the Kshaya Vriddhi, how to show the Kshaya Vriddhi, has been discussed in one of the chapters of Vishnudharmottara. I can quote so many shlokas, but then we will have to go on reading shlokas one after another, and that is why I am avoiding to read out the shlokas time and again. I am concentrating more on the content of it. So, Sadrishyam Kshaya Vriddhischa Gunashtakam Idam Shrutam. These are the 8 important gunas, these are the 8 important qualities that are required from a painting. Along with these gunas, even though doshas have been described, and Bruhad Gandaushta, so having 2 large eyes, or very thick leaves, boggled eyes, or broken line. There is a long list which has been given and which has been identified as the dosha in painting. So this is, as I told you, that this is almost a handbook for the practicing painter. But along with this handbook, they have also tried to discuss some conceptual elements. So one more thing, Kshaya Vriddhi, Vartana and Nimnonnat. Nimnonnat, Nimna and Unnat, receding and protruding. If you go to, this is very interesting, and you actually see this element of Nimnonnata in Ajanta painting. In Ajanta painting, you can see that some of the things are being protruding further and some of the things are receding. This recession and protrusion, how to show the recession and protrusion, that too has been discussed in Vishnudharmottara. But all these things are technical matters. I personally am quite impressed by a very small chapter in Vishnudharmottara which speaks about the Chitra Prakara. Chitra Prakara. We'll read out the shlokas related to it and then discuss them. So, the prakaras of Chitra. If you remember, while talking about Riti, I briefly mentioned that there are 4 prakaras of Chitra discussed in Vishnudharmottara. These prakaras need to be interpreted properly. Otherwise, if you remember, while talking about Riti, I already mentioned these prakaras briefly in my discussion because they are comparable to the different ritis or different vrittis of literature. These prakaras have been described as Yat Kinchit Loka Sadrishyam, Chitram Tat Satyam Uchyate, Dirghangam Sapramanam Cha, Sukumaram Subhumikam, Chaturastra Susampurnam Cha, Dirgham Nolbanakritim, Pramanasthana Lambadhyam, Vainikam Tannigadyate, Drudopachita Sarvangam, Vartulam Naghanolbanam, Chitram Tan Nagaram Jneyam, Swalpamalya Vibhushanam. Now, these are the 4 shlokas we talk about. The 4th one, these are the 3 prakaras. The 4th one is called the Mishra Chitra, which has mixed characteristics. What I really feel amazed about is it almost speaks about the 3 phases of Indian art. The first one, Yat Kinchit Loka Sadrishyam, Chitram Tat Satyam Uchyate. Now let's not forget, just now we discussed the date of Vishnudharmottara Purana, which is probably 6th century AD. Now this person, the maker of Vishnudharmottara, seems to be very well conversant with different art traditions of India, because while talking about the technique of painting, he has discussed every detail about it, and he talks about sculpture also. So when he says that when the painting or sculpture, the chitra, has loka sadrishyam, when it is realistic, yat kinchit loka sadrishyam, when it shows similarity with reality, which means it is realistic in nature, naturalistic in nature, the chitram tat satyam uchyate. Such a picture should be called a satya chitra. Dirghangam sapramanam cha. The bodies are fuller bodies, and sukumaram subhumikam. Subhumikam. Normally these paintings or these sculptures are carved against proper background. Subhumikam. They have a proper background. Now, if you recollect the Kushana painting, this is almost a description of Kushana painting, because Gupta sculpture is not very naturalistic. The later sculpture is not very naturalistic. It is highly stylized. The only phase where you find a reasonable naturalism in Indian art is Kushana period. So there you can see, if you see Kushana sculpture, it is always placed against a beautiful background. Gupta sculpture is always carved on a stele, not with a background. So this could be a phase which goes back to 1st, 2nd century AD. Then comes a phase, if you remember, after 2nd, 3rd century till Gupta period, there is a hiatus in Indian art. Nothing very important has happened, but at the same time, a lot of technical progress can be seen in that particular period. A lot of experimentation can be seen in that particular period. It is almost like the cocoon phase of Indian art. You know what a cocoon is. In the morning we were talking about it, that sometimes in the process of metamorphosis, you think that nothing is happening. When the larva enters into the cocoon looks dead. You think that it is not moving, it is not living, but actually the larva is getting converted into the larva, a pupa, and then the cocoon. In the cocoon phase, which is called a chrysalis, in chrysalis phase, that larva is getting converted into a butterfly, and then the butterfly comes out. I think here it speaks about that phase, which is Vainika. This phase is called Vainika phase. Chaturastram susampurnam cha dirgham nolbanaकृतिम pramanasthana rambadhyam Vainikam tannigadyate. Now, there is a big debate about the word Vainika. Sri Shivaram Murthy says that the painting, the Chitra and Shilpa, which is very sweet, like the sound of Veena, should be called Vainika. But I think this comparison is not very convincing. Painting sweet like the sound of Veena doesn't convince me much. I thought about the balance, because this is talking about a perfect balanced painting or perfect balanced sculpture. I thought about the possibility of the Veena's appearance. Have you seen a Veena? A Veena, unlike the sitar or tanpura, has two bulbs and they are of equal size. So it is a perfectly balanced instrument, and I thought perhaps the word Vainika must have come from that balance. But then I discovered that in Khagola Shastra there is a particular yoga which is called Vainika yoga, when all the constellations come together in a perfect balance. So where there is perfect balance, that yoga is called Vainika yoga, and that is why this perfectly balanced sculptural style must have been called a Vainika style by the maker of Vishnudharmottara. So this particular phase is quite balanced, quite technically correct, but it doesn't have much of a life in it. It looks very lifeless, because it is a transitional phase of Indian art which comes in 3rd, 4th century. And then we enter into the phase which is the most glorious phase of Indian art, that is the Gupta period, which is considered to be the classical phase of Indian art. He says that Dhurupachita sarvangam vartulam na ghanolbanam. Dhurupachita sarvangam, the bodies are properly rendered and developed. Vartulam na ghanolbanam, but they are not fat and they are not very slim also. They are perfectly proportionate. Chitram tan nagaram dneyam Swalpamalya Vibhushanam. That picture should be considered as Nagara picture which doesn't have much of a decoration on it. Gupta period is the phase in Indian art which doesn't have much of a decoration in it. It is portrayed, the Gupta sculpture is always portrayed with extreme restraint, and you hardly find any ornamentation in Gupta period. It is the simplest phase in Indian art tradition. So here Swalpamalya Vibhushanam and the sophistication, Nagaram is sophisticated. The sophistication of Gupta sculpture and the kind of simplicity which you see in that particular period perhaps is described in this particular shloka. So I personally, this is my personal interpretation, that perhaps the maker of Vishnudharmottara is talking about the three phases in Indian art tradition. And then he says that there are mixed traditions also. There are many interesting things in Vishnudharmottara. It's a small text. You can read it on your own. But before I conclude this session, I want to tell you about a very interesting statement which the maker of Vishnudharmottara says. He says that all these things, the making of the lines, Vartana, the Kshaya Vruddhi, Nimnonnata Pramanas, etc., etc., all these things can be taught a rookie, or all these things can be taught to an apprentice. But there are quite a few things which cannot be taught. An apprentice can be a very good technician, an apprentice can be a very skilled worker, but only those skills do not make him an artist. But these things do not make him a real artist. A real artist is that who does not only paint the flag, but he can paint the fluttering of the flag. He does not only paint the fire, but he paints the heat of the fire. He has the capacity to differentiate between the sleeping animal and a dead animal. If he can paint that life in the sleeping animal, then such an artist should be considered as a real artist. A master artist is him who goes beyond the visuality of that painting and tries to paint the things behind those visual elements, the life in that painting. The person who can depict the life in that painting is the real master. Vishnudharmottara is almost like a fountainhead for the later Shilpa text, later text on visual arts, which were compiled in 11th and 12th century. But the range that you see in Vishnudharmottara Puran is not seen in any of those texts. And that is why Vishnudharmottara remains the most distinct text in the study of visual arts.